All right, the next component we're going to implement is the callout component. Now, on the surface, this kind of looks like our card component, but there are a couple of differences. The first difference is that this component doesn't have any shadows. The second difference is that the entire component has a background color. But in our implementation of the card component, we assume that a card can have a header and a body, and it's only the header that can have a background color. Now, to reuse the card component here, we'll have to put all this content inside the card header, but this is semantically incorrect because we don't have a header section here. So I can go back and revisit the card component and make it more flexible, but that's going to be a little bit confusing for you because I have to make sure that any changes I apply there are not going to break the existing component. So instead of going back and forth, I'm going to create a brand new component here. Now, you might think this is a very simple component and you may want to skip this lesson, but trust me, there are a few tricky parts here, so watch this lesson to the end. So on desktop, we have a 2-column grid, and on mobile, we have a 1-column grid. So back to index.html, we're going to add a div with 2 classes, callout and callout _primary for giving it that particular background color. Inside this component, we're going to have a grid. Well, a 2-column grid. So we add the second class, 1 by 2. Good. Now, inside the grid, we're going to have 2 items. So we have 2 columns. In the first column, we have some content, which includes a heading and some text. And in the second column, we have a button. So in this grid, we're going to have 2 items. The first one is a div. We can give it a class like callout _content. This is the div that wraps a heading and a paragraph. So we can say ready to get started. And then we add the paragraph with some words. Good. So this is our first item that goes in the first column. Then we're going to add the second item, which is a button. Now, more accurately, this is going to be an anchor element because when the user clicks on this button, they should go to a different page. So we add an anchor with 2 classes, btn and btn secondary. Now we're going to say get started. Good. Now let's work on styling. So we go to our style sheet and create a new section, callouts. Here's our first rule. For the callout component, we're going to apply some padding and a border radius of 5 pixels. Now to give it the primary color, we create the second rule, callout primary, and here we set the background to the primary color. And of course, we want to make the text white so it stands out. Let's test our implementation up to this point. Holy cow, what happened to our button? Don't worry, we're going to fix it in a second. First, let's work on the content. So the heading is dark blue. We have to turn it to white. And we have some extra space over here, which is coming from the top margin of the heading. So back to our markup. Here's our h2 element. We're going to give it a class, callout _heading. Now, back to our style sheet. Let's define a rule for our heading. We're going to set the color to white and remove the top margin. So we can say margin top is 0. We should also set the font size to 3 rams. That is based on what we have on mobile. So here's what we get. I think that looks pretty good. Now, what is going on with the button? Well, this has to do with the alignment of items in a grid. So let's say we have a grid. Temporarily, I'm just going to create this rule. If this is a grid, here we have 2 properties for aligning items. We have justify items for horizontal alignment and align items for vertical alignment. Now, the default value of these properties is stretch. So that is the reason why this button has stretched horizontally and vertically. Now, to solve this problem, we have to change the alignment of this button. So let's get rid of this temporary rule. We're going to define a new rule for buttons in a callout component. Here I'm going to set align self to center. So instead of justify items, which should be applied to the grid, we're going to use justify self. This is a property we apply to a grid item. So horizontally, where should we place this? Back to our mobile version, the button should be horizontally in the center. So we set this to center. Now, what about vertical alignment? For that, instead of align items, which we apply to a grid, we're going to use align self. Now, what value should we use here? Back to the desktop version, vertically, this button should be in the center. So we set this to center as well. Now, take a look. Okay, the problem is solved. Now, let me make the browser smaller so we see the actual mobile version. So our text alignment is not right here because on mobile, the counter is center aligned, but here we have left alignment. So earlier we defined this div, callout content, which wraps an H2 and a paragraph. We're going to define a rule for this element. So we say callout __ content. Here we're going to set text align to center. Good. So here's what we get. I think this is very close to what we have in our design mockup. The only difference is that this button has extra horizontal padding. Now we can come back to this rule for buttons in a callout. We can apply the padding here, but this is not a reusable solution. What if somewhere else in a different component, we want to have a button with more horizontal padding? Object-oriented CSS says that we should separate content from container. So instead of applying the padding here, we're going to define a reusable class or a reusable skin for our buttons. So let's go to the button section. Okay. Here we're going to define a new class or a new skin for our buttons. I'm going to call that btn _ long. Or a better name is stretched. So here I'm going to apply a padding left of 6 rems and a padding right of 6 rems. Now that we have this reusable class, we can apply it in our markup. So this is where we have our button. I'm going to add the second class, which is btn stretched. Good. Let's take a look. That's what we get. This is very close to our mobile version. Great. Now, what about desktop version? Well, earlier we defined a breakpoint of 768 for tablets. From this breakpoint onward, we have to change the alignment of content. So instead of center aligned, we want to use left aligned. So back to the styles of the callout component, we're going to define a new media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we're going to define a new rule for callout content and set text align to left. That is the first improvement. So that's better. Now for tablets or wider screens, we don't want the button to be horizontally in the center because it will be separated from the content. We want it to be close to the content. So we want to push it to the left side of the horizontal axis. How do we do that? Back to our media query, we define a new rule for callout btn. And here we set justify self, which is a property we apply to a grid item. We set it to start. So earlier we set this to center for mobile. Now we set it to start. Now take a look. Okay, the button is closer, but we need to give it some margin. So I'm going to give it a horizontal margin of 2 rems. Take a look. That is better. Now, the other problem we have here is that we have 2 columns. Each is taking 50% of the page. So we have so much space wasted over here. Wouldn't that be nicer if the content column would stretch and take up all the extra space? Let me show you how to do that. So back to our media query, I'm going to define a new rule for our grid. So in our callout component, if we have a grid that is 1 by 2, we're going to change the template of this grid. So we set grid template columns. Previously, we set this to 1fr and 1fr. That is why we got 2 columns with equal width, but we don't want that. So for the second column, we're going to use auto, and this will make the column get wide enough to fit the button. All the extra space will be allocated to the first column. Take a look. Okay, look, the first column has stretched and the second column is now smaller. If I make my browser wider, look, the first column keeps stretching and getting more space. Great. So here's the mobile version and here's the version for tablets and desktops. Everything looks great. So let's move on to the next lesson.